many ways, but it's also going to be very much about Scandinavian thoughts and ideas, and that bridges with the lecture that we've done before, that is about Scandinavian history from a little bit before the Viking era until, well, basically the 21st century. So that said, I'm going to have to recap a little bit what I did, and we're going to return to a question that I asked in that lecture. So if you were in that lecture and if you made notes, it's a good idea to bring those up now. And in 1809, to give you a snapshot of what society in Sweden was like at the time. In 1809, we had a lot of things going on. There was things that had led up to Sweden as an empire crashing, becoming the Sweden we know today. We also had constitutional changes. We had a re-establishment of monarchical rule, and I explained this last time as sort of a little sidetracking from the very long heritage of shared decision making and democracy. Later on in 1809, I don't know why it doesn't agree with me here. The time that we call the Age of Liberty was brought back, could you say that? Or rather, the values that we saw during the Age of Liberty came back, and the best way that I can simplify and describe what's going on in Swedish society is that there is somewhat of a disagreement with the court, the monarch of Sweden, the ideas of Sweden being a monarchy, and how much power should reside in parliament and in democratic rule. And that's in that divide, we're taking a starting point right now. Because we are going to talk about what happens later. And what happens later is that we see a development where there's actually unrest in Europe, and this leads to an economic crisis. At this point in time, and this is the major point, my starting point for the lecture today, at this point in time, 90% of the people still earn their livelihood from agriculture. And I'm going to share with you a theory about the creation of the Swedish welfare state and the Scandinavian model that is based on the idea that agriculture and farmers played a large role in giving power to the people through democracy. We have the idea that they played a large role. Now this is a contested idea. This is an idea that has, in the academic debate regarding this, actually been opposed. So I'm also going to share what possible impact that could have made, together with an explanation of why it might not be the case. Either way, there's a historical connection and also historical prerequisites that make that model quite sensible. because it means that you understand Swedish society and you understand the development during the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, the famine that we had. And in that context, I think it's important to tell that part of history. One consequence of what was going on here was emigration. And I repeatedly talk about how Sweden wasn't the welfare state that we see today. For a very long time, Sweden was at the outer boundaries of Europe, and it was an agricultural society that was a very poor society where the social support systems were not at all, not nearly as effective as they are today. And we would have considered Sweden to be one of the poorest developing countries, to use a term that I don't really like, one of the poorest developing countries in the world. But in 200 years' time, roughly, something has changed, and that's what we're talking about today. This is around 1890. And like I said, a very large part of the population leave. They emigrate. Many of them emigrate and move towards the United States. There are still large Swedish populations in the United States with Swedish cultural heritage. We also have the Industrial Revolution, and one outcome of this is developing infrastructure, building railroads, for example. Railroads come to Sweden. This infrastructure enables settling and building cities in parts of Sweden that were inaccessible previously. It also launches a development that means that we now get access to our natural resources. And Sweden is a land with vast natural resources, which also leads in turn to the possibility of an economic boom. So the 20th century, and this is where I left off last time, the 20th century is a century of reforms. We see emergence of strong popular movements, the development of free churches, and I bring that up because that is the region that we're in. This is a region in Sweden sometimes known as the Swedish Bible Belt, where many of the free churches started and were funded. Free churches are basically Protestant denominations, different denominations within the same Protestant church. They contributed a lot to the development of Sweden as well. For example, in ethical values, contributing to the ideas of lessening drinking's temperance, but also at the same time we have labor movements and we have women's movements. The first wave feminism comes into play here. Together with this, society is changing. It's changing towards a more healthy society. It's changing towards a more equal society, both in gender equality and equality for workers. And that is why I want to bring up this model of explanation, talking about the farmers' impact, because many of the new workers were farmers before. Sweden here is transitioning from an agricultural society into a society of workers during the industrialization. So if you open up the Wikipedia page about the Swedish welfare state, it's going to say that the model of explanation where farmers had a large impact on this is not really accurate. And the reason for that is that, well, the farmers actually became the workers, and the worker unions, the unionization, and the impact of unions and workers in politics as they gained entrance into the Swedish parliament had an immense impact. So sometimes I might say farmers, but actually I mean workers. So This also led to the Social Democrats entering government. In 1909, in Sweden, universal suffrage was introduced, and for women, it was introduced in 1921. One of the first countries in the world to introduce universal suffrage for women. And the plans for a welfare state were drawn up during the 1930s with a prime minister called Per Albin Hansson, whom we're going to talk a little bit more about later on. So this is where we left off and where we're getting started. Which means that I'm going to switch, but let's see if you recognize anything here. This is a protest for women's rights. It is free suffrage for all women. Suffrage means you're allowed to vote. This is one of the first Systembolag. You guys know Systembolaget, right? Yes. Hard to not know. And this was also introduced when Sweden transitioned. We have the same things in all the Scandinavian countries. This was instituted when Sweden transitioned from being a quite unhealthy country. There are examples of dock workers being paid in alcohol. They got their salary pay in alcohol. So and then you can imagine what type of country we were dealing with. This was needed, and it's no coincidence that the temperance or teetotaler organizations work together with churches in order to make the country a more healthy country. Also, in 1974, we got a new instrument of government, basically the description of how government works. And from then on, the ways that Sweden has been building the welfare state has been much affected by this. All public power now is derived from the people, effectively taking away all power from the monarchy. But that was as late as 1974. Previously, one of the remaining laws for how government worked in Sweden was that the king actually had power to choose the prime minister, as in the UK currently. The Swedish king could actually deny someone from becoming prime minister, but that is no longer from 1974. Right, I will stop sharing that right now, and I'm going to switch to another PowerPoint for this lecture. Just as a little summary of what the last lecture was about. This lecture is about Scandinavian thoughts and ideas. What do Scandinavians think? Yes, question. Symbolic is the best answer. The role of the king currently in Sweden is symbolic. He's a representative. Think of him as the top ambassador. Is that surprising? But in other monarchies, Spain, for example, and in the United Kingdom, the monarchs still have actual power over government in one way or another, albeit very small. So, topics for today is geography. And the last lecture talked about how important the actual placement of Scandinavia was. For example, the fact that Germanic tribes were able to resist the Roman Empire from spreading, which initiated separate cultural development. And we're going to follow that track a little bit into this and how that has affected Scandinavian geopolitics. So if you have questions about things that I'm saying, it might be because I'm referring back a little bit to the previous lecture. So don't be afraid to ask up with the hand and ask if you have any questions about that. We'll also talk about cultural aspects and the historical development. We'll talk about human rights, fundamental laws, social contract. And this goes back to the very things that I just talked about, the development towards workers' rights, women's rights, during the transition from an agricultural society to an industrialized society. We'll also talk about the political systems and systems of government and coalitions. So this map shows the part of Sweden that gave Scandinavia its name, Scania. The name comes from Scania, as that was the first part of Scandinavia that was encountered by people from the outside describing where we are. So Scandinavia is named after Scania in Sweden. We're part of a Scandinavian dialect continuum. It means that me, as a native Swedish speaker, I understand most of what the people from Norway say and some of what Danes say. I actually understand most of it. It's just that we don't like the Danish, do we? And in the previous lecture, I was also talking about this brotherly schism, brotherly fight between the nations. And I also listed all of the wars and unions back and forth. It's basically one every 5 years. If you look back at the last 500 years of history, there's either a war with Denmark or we're in a union with Denmark. And sometimes Denmark owns Norway and sometimes Sweden owns Norway. And that's basically 500 years of history summarized. But this is important because we have mutually intelligible languages. Actually, it's North Germanic languages, and that also means that there's a certain connection between these languages and West Germanic languages and the Germanic languages overall, which means that I have a decent comprehension of German and English from knowing Swedish. But one thing that is really interesting is that when I say Scandinavian, then I mean Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. In an international context, Scandinavia is usually meant to include Finland and Iceland as well, and sometimes Greenland. But that's not what I mean when I talk about Scandinavia, because I would use Norden instead when I talk about Finland and Iceland and Greenland as well, the Nordic countries. So when I talk about Scandinavia now, I need you guys to understand that I mean Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And I'll try to use the Nordic countries or Norden, because you guys speak enough Swedish to understand Norden, right? Yeah. Good, perfect. So in English, sometimes this is confused. Important to remember, right? It's also important to remember this constellation of countries because of the unions. And we have a closer and closer collaboration after the industrialization of these countries and after a long history of either being at war or in union. After the breakup of the union between Norway and Sweden, there is still very tight collaboration between these countries, and they have developed in very similar directions. For a long time, these wars and unions both contributed to disagreements, but also very clear agreement in culture, tradition, and a direction in development of politics, even to nationalism. And during the 1800s, late 1800s and early 1900s, we see a very clear direction in what's called nationalromantik, national romance era. This is where images like the Viking with the horns is developed. For example, Vikings didn't actually have horns on their helmets, but images to promote this culture, the historical heritage, was used in order to promote brotherhood between the countries and promote nationalism. This is in an era when nationalism as a whole is growing in all of Europe, resulting in the First and Second World Wars in a way, unfortunately, and also resulting in Sweden, for example, being the leading country of research into races and differences between races. This is a very dark heritage of Uppsala University, for example. So portraying both the light and dark collaboration and connections between these countries, we are a part of the same geopolitical areas. Bringing it into current ways of expressing this collaboration, the easiest way is to describe this as the fact that we are part of the same geopolitical areas. Geopolitical means that politics are partly affected by where in the world you are. And that has been the same for a long time. We're at the outskirts of Europe, but at the same time, we're in a position that makes Scandinavia both vulnerable, as we will see, and placed in a very strategic position for trade, both west and east. As you know, the Vikings, and with their heritage of being traders and seafarers, traveled east from Sweden through the rivers of Russia, even naming Russia, towards Ukraine, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. There is a long heritage within this culture that has developed separately from the Roman culture to trade, to keep international contacts. And that's something that I'm going to build on today in my explanation of why these countries are as they are and why Scandinavians think the way they think. But if we look at the overview of which geopolitical areas we belong to, in many ways, the Scandinavian countries are in Northern Europe. Of course, we have, through the European Union and the Eurozone, collaborations with all of the other countries. We're going to look at the differences as well when we look at a few maps later on, which is where my references are going to come in. We're a part of the Northern European zone within the EU and the European continent. Southern Europe is a little bit different. That's the best way I can describe it currently. But there are also geopolitical differences between the Scandinavian countries and Central Europe and Southern Europe. Eastern Europe usually is described as having a lower development factor than Western Europe. Some of the explanations are that they were part of the Soviet Union or affected by the Soviet Union turned eastwards, but also the fact that the Iron Curtain meant that industrial development couldn't start at the same point as industrial development did in Germany, for example, with the war reparations and the support that Germany got from the West in order to rebuild. Historically and religiously, we are connected and disconnected. Currently, Sweden is a highly multicultural country, as with the other Scandinavian countries. And previously, I've explained that it took a long time for the Catholic Church to become an influential element in Scandinavian society. It took much longer than in Southern Europe, for example. And then very early, the change from the Catholic Church to the Protestant Church meant that we had a state church instead of a European church. Instead of the Catholic Church governed by the Pope, we broke away from that, becoming our own. Actually, much in line with the way religion worked in Scandinavian society 1,000 years ago. There's an interesting discussion regarding whether or not Scandinavian countries and the Scandinavian model is communist or capitalist. If you ask people from very capitalist countries where free trade and laissez-faire politics usually mean that you have a very free economy, they view the high taxes in Scandinavian welfare states as very socialist. The strong governance from the government in where the money is spent is also often viewed as socialist or communist. Sometimes it's discussed if there's Muslim or Christian influence in culture. And for a very long time, obviously, you've seen the flags, right? There's a big cross on the Scandinavian flags. So the Christian influence is obviously there. And you know about why the Christian influence is so relevant as well, because that's one of the factors changing Scandinavian countries from agrarian, quite poor countries into the industrial societies that they are today. Now, I'd say it's a multicultural society, and I'd also say that the promoted equality promotes that to a degree. As you know, there are also trade agreements in place. Question? The Catholic Church was founded in Rome, traditionally said to be founded by Peter, Saint Peter, in Rome. And the Roman Church developed at the same time as the Roman Empire. In 476, there was a split between the Roman Empire splitting into the East and West Roman empires. The emperors politically started governing them as separate empires, leading to the fall of both empires in the long term. But at the same time, as the Roman Catholic Church was much associated with the development of these empires, and actually a very important force, the church also split. It split into the Eastern and Western churches. There was a separate head for the now Orthodox, meaning true faith or That's the best translation I can give. There's a head, similarity to the Pope, if I put it that way, for the Orthodox Church as well. Then the Protestant Church was created by reformists in the 1500s, breaking from the Catholic Church as they viewed the Catholic Church as having become corrupted. So trade agreements and Schengen. Schengen is important, right? Why is Schengen important? It's like a union. What does it mean? The countries work as one big country. This, for example, don't look at the photo. I'm embarrassed. This means that this is the only thing I need to go from whatever country in Schengen to another country in Schengen. I don't need a passport, really. I don't have to tell anyone that I'm going across borders. There could be a border check, but usually there isn't. I could drive through Europe without encountering a single border check. So what does it mean? I mean, why do I bring these up when talking about geopolitical areas? Well, there are definitely different values between Southern Europe and Northern Europe when it comes to religion playing a part in how much politics are affected by religion. Definitely. If you ask questions about abortion and we compare between Sweden and Italy, you're going to get very different answers from people depending on their values, and those values are affected by their religion. We'll look into religion soon, but in essence, these geopolitical areas, they affect socioeconomic connotations. They have an effect on the Human Development Index, for example. They have an effect on how you view education. They have a large effect on climate, ecology, what you can and can't do. The Baltic Sea has had an immense strategic importance, and natural resources are different in these geopolitical areas. That is also an explanation for why the Scandinavian countries sometimes stand out. Let's move on to see what I mean when I say that they sometimes stand out. This is the Global Competitiveness Index, basically how competitive or strategically competitive a country is. This is from 2019. You have Sweden here as number 8. You have Denmark here as number 10, and Norway here as number 17. The 3 Scandinavian countries are at the top 20 in global competitiveness. This is connected to the long cultural heritage and history of practicing trade as independent from the European continuum, or the Southern European continuum. This is also connected to liberty. Remember the age of liberty? This is connected to mentality. This is connected to values and beliefs, openness of society. The ideas of institutions policies, and other factors that determine the level of productivity. Now, talking about religion, something that within the Scandinavian countries is heavily connected to productivity is the Protestant Lutheran faith. That is weird. But during the Reformation, there was an idea that in order to be a good person, ora et labora. Has anyone heard that before? Ora, pray. Labora, work. Pray and work. Ideas brought forth together with some ideas like sola scriptura and sola fide in the Protestant Reformation. Only scripture, not all of these guys in nice hats, only the book. Anyone can preach. We're equal in faith. This is the Reformation, and especially in the 1800s, when we see free churches being established across the Scandinavian countries. You don't have to be a priest. You don't have to be a bishop. We don't need those, is the general idea here. Get rid of those guys in nice hats. Don't give your gold to them. Everyone can preach. Sola scriptura, only the book, right? And only faith, sola fide, are ideas within this religious revolution actually promoting religious equality. Anyone can praise, anyone can read. Anyone can read. Now it's connected to education as well. The establishment of a school system that is equal for everyone. And this affects the level of productivity. If we look at the same rankings for 2022, this is global competitiveness in 2022. You can see that they are now top 10. Denmark is number 1, Sweden is number 4, and Norway is number 9 in the global competitiveness index. If we look at digital ranking, which is a newer type of ranking, there's actually a link to this in the PowerPoint as well. If you want to PowerPoint, it's in Canvas for those of you taking the Life and Studies course. Denmark in digital ranking is now number 1, Sweden is number 3, and Norway is number 12. What does digital competitiveness mean? Well, it's about infrastructure mainly and competence, digital literacy, information literacy, the ability to take part in digital culture and digital production. Digital production, of course, being one thing that is really important. You might know that Sweden is quite famous internationally, both for music production and game production. Game production is included in the digital ranking. The possibility to do that is here. Look at that. If we move on to talent ranking, speaking of music, if we move on to talent ranking, Sweden is listed as top 2, Norway top 4, and Denmark number 5. Out of over 200 countries listed in the rankings. And it has to do with very many things. Culture being one of them, and the transformation into a welfare state, promoting equal participation in society, building away participatory gaps, which is one of the aims of creating the welfare state and creating what's known as folkhemmet. This is Travel and Tourism Development Index in 2021. We have Denmark and Sweden in the top 20 positions. Norway is not a part of any of the global networks listed here, so they're actually not on the list, unfortunately. So I have a few more of these, and I'm going to pause at this one. This is from the World Economic Forum, listing global gender gap index. Here you can see Norway and Sweden. Denmark is actually in position 32, way below. Feels good. No. But where's your country? Open this up on your, see if you can find it. Search for World Economic Forum, Global Gender Gap Index. Where's your home country? This is actually a geopolitical effect as well, making Denmark end up here. Denmark is culturally closer to Southern Europe and Western Europe, where gender gaps are higher than in the Nordic countries. Now I use that word, in Norden. Gender gap, the cultural difference between men and women and their participation. So very good question. What is the gender gap? The gender gap, if you take Saudi Arabia, for example, in Saudi Arabia, there are certain things that women are not allowed to do. More and more so. More and more they're actually doing everything. Yes. Because it's not a very clever idea not allowing women to work, because only half of the country works, and that's kind of I have a more interesting question. And please contribute, those of you who are online, please contribute in the chat if you can find the number for your country. Why? What the, yes, let's search for it. Let's Google what's the global gender gap. Absolutely. What is the global gender gap? This is a very good question. What's global gender gap? Let's look at their definitions. This is the World Economic Forum. So let's bring that up and make sure that I'm sharing that screen as well. So Global Gender Gap Report. Gender parity is the name of the index that they're using. If you want to, you can look up statistics concerning gender parity. If you know how to use Gapminder, have you heard about Gapminder? Gapminder is this visualization tool of global statistics, founded by Professor of International Health Hans Rosling. Gender parity is a measurement of equality between men and women in the way that they can participate and interact with society. So gender parity index basically means measurements such as participation in parliament, female representation or women's representation in all parts of government, women's representation in private company boards, women's participation in the workforce. are all tabulated together, put together into an index to measure the equality between men and women in participation in society. And one argument that, did you find Gapminder? Play around with it when you have time. It's a fun thing. So what I'm arguing here is that there are actually very long-term, both geopolitical and cultural effects leading up to differences in gender parity. If you think back to your country's placement, your home country's placement, you can probably explain why there's a difference or why there is equality. You probably have a reasonably good idea about the cultural and historical reasons for that. If I talk to my mother about what it was like in her day, she was born in 1943. Sweden was a very different country by then. It's changed during her lifetime. She's one of the people who have contributed to the change. So this is, of course, actually changing constantly, which is why we have an index to be able to compare it over time. Let's move on and see what the next thing is. This is the happiness ranking in 2017 to 2019. Again, Scandinavian countries are happy. What does it mean that Scandinavian countries are happy? Does it mean that I smile all the time? No, I don't smile all the time. We have Monday mornings in Sweden as well. So yes, quality of life. Yes. Yeah, it's actually a little bit of a misnomer because it's a measurement of quality of life, standard of living. You can see, let's add in Norden, right? Iceland is right there. Finland, I think, has been a top country for a quite long time, actually. What does it look like now? It looks like this. So these are the different measurements you can see here adding on to it. Perceptions of corruption is one measurement. And of course, you know, well, technically it makes me happy when people are not corrupt, of course, but happiness is perhaps not the right name for it. Perceptions of corruption contribute to this. Generosity. Freedom to make life changes. Healthy life expectancy. Life expectancy is a measurement of this. Social support. How much social support there is. Where is my daughter right now, do you think? My daughter's 2 years old. Where is she? Where is she? No, sorry. Where do you think she is? Daycare. Yes, obviously. Where am I going to be when I'm 90 years old? Yeah, probably. Let's face reality. I'll retire by 100. I'll probably be in an old people's home, right? Scandinavian societies are societies where over a lifetime there is social support from society. Now, sometimes we kind of get the feedback in intercultural settings. We get the feedback that, don't you care about your children? Why don't you leave them with family? You know? Yes. It's strange, isn't it? In a way. Why do you let your parents, when they're old, go into an old people's home? Why, you know, can't you take care of them yourself? And for a very long time, society has had this support system, which means that It's the normal, and it's a sometimes very strange normal. I can convey to you the fact that people from the Scandinavian countries sometimes don't realize how odd they are. In an international context, it's much more common to have a connection with family, a very strong connection with family, to know your history, to be connected to a religion, to make decisions in everyday life based on religion, to consider the expectations on you from family. Expectations from family, for example, is included here in freedom to make life changes. As you can see here, Scandinavian countries are again in the top. So are there any other contributing factors? I've tried my very best, and I hope that now that I summarize this a little bit, I hope that I have been able to connect historically to aspects of culture and politics, and also the geopolitical settings. For example, the isolation of the Scandinavian countries that has contributed to the development of a separate culture, being the odd ones on the borders of the large European continent, in the outskirts of Europe. For a very long time, this has actually been the case, and separate culture developed during that time. But the way that Scandinavians now interact with religion is vastly different from if we compare to Southern European countries, where the Roman Catholic Church still has quite a large influence. Something that changed in the Scandinavian countries and Northern European countries a long time ago, but more so in what's called väckelserörelsen, an awakening in religion during the 1800s. This thing that I've talked about, trying to improve society. We have allemansrätten. This is perhaps one of the most interesting endeavors or investigations into the mentality of Scandinavians. It exists in all the Scandinavian countries. In Denmark, there is a more restricted freedom to roam. It can be translated into freedom to roam when it comes to privately held land, because there it's the landowners that decide on whether or not you can freely roam their lands. But all beaches, all sand dunes, all publicly owned forests, and everything that is uncultivated or not fenced in Denmark is open to the public to freely roam. In Sweden and Norway, we have a complete right to freely roam. Doesn't matter who owns the land. Now, that means that I also have certain expectations on me when I do that. There are rules I have to follow. I'm not allowed to leave gates open if there's cattle grazing. I'm not allowed to pick certain or forage certain things. For example, hazelnuts. I'm prohibited from harvesting. I can't pollute. I have to take everything that I bring in with me out. And there are very, very strong penalties in Sweden and Norway if you don't. But we have allemansrätten, and what does it mean? Well, the interesting thing is that I have the freedom to use the land as I see please. I can go out and forage berries. Sweden as with Norway, consists of roughly 35% covered area in blueberry, which is insane when you think about it. So my freezer at home is filled with blueberries because I go out, it takes an hour, you pick a few liters of blueberries and you have all winter, right? Lingonberry is the same. Mushrooms, it means that I can forage of the lands and I can fish as long as I follow the rules. This is interesting because this is not a law. This is a non-law. This exists in the void between laws. So there's no law stating that I have the right to do this. It's simply from a very long heritage and history of being allowed to have these rights, that the laws that have been written in the constitutions starting in the 1700s, moving up to the new constitution of 1974 that I mentioned earlier, simply don't include any laws banning people from doing this. And it's a very important thing to understand when we talk about allemansrätten, that it has been absolutely impossible because of Swedish and Scandinavian mentality to get such laws through the parliament. No one can conceive of the idea to limit these rights. Think about that. So there are no laws limiting it. And now, since I'm a very curious person, I'd like you guys to think, pair, and share regarding allemansrätten. And 2 questions. You guys who are online, please contribute in the chat and I will relay to the people in the classroom. Have you actually exercised this right? You guys are in Sweden, right? Have you actually exercised this right? Have you tried it out? And is there any similar rule, right, or law in your home culture? Think first, take a minute, then pair together with someone you're sitting next to and share. Yeah. Happiness. All right. So we're getting back. I like think, pair, share exercises, and it's wonderful to hear a classroom buzzing with students talking. I'm going to carry on here, and I'm going to draw one conclusion. And that conclusion is that for a very long time, for a very long time, for a very long time, freedom was the norm in European countries and actually countries all over the globe. If you look at indigenous populations across the globe, the freedom to roam is an element of their lifestyle over as a whole. If you compare the indigenous populations in North America to the culture that was introduced during colonization, you can actually research the freedom of Rome and you can compare these two cultures and you can see that that is one of the main differences. So freedom to roam is, during the history of mankind, the normal. The restriction is, if you look from a long and broad historical perspective, the breaking of that norm. Do you know who this is? Talking about breaking norms. But I've been talking for quite a long time and it's time for a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 3 o'clock. I'll go get a cup of coffee and I'll see you back in 10 minutes or so. Good question. Hey, we are slowly getting back. I noticed that not everyone has gotten back to their laptops, and I'm going to start talking a little bit in the meantime as people are settling in. Because I'm going to refer to something that I saw in the chat here. John Teacher answered that it's possible to break the law utilizing freedom to roam. Find that very, very interesting. Oh, let's settle in, have a seat. Let's get started again. Get back. Come on. So that we can get back to the lecture. Now, always takes a little time. Now, there's a question also when you look at happiness reports. There's a question about how much during the development of the situation we are in today, how much have I been told to think what I think, and how much am I free to think what I think? So in some measurements, those measurements are complicated by the fact that they are subjective measurements, and that we're effectively measuring, for example, how much I can change my life if I want to, how much opportunity I have to switch from teaching to going into to business or whatever I want to do. Those opportunities, of course, depend on a lot of things, but also perception of this depends on a lot of things. So that's where we are now, and that's why I chose to use Greta here as an example. In the beginning of this revolution, or in this movement, at one point before this movement spread internationally as Fridays for Future, she engaged across the globe 1.4 million people, even before it actually became a globally structured campaign. In the early days, when she was sitting outside of the Swedish Parliament. And of course, there was certain academic interest in what was going on, because one thing that's connected to this is, for example, flight shaming or environmental shaming. The idea that the individual is supposed to feel responsible for climate change and pollution. And of course, you can use what's called nudging. I don't know if you're familiar with this as a social concept or social hacking concept, but what's called stochastic activism. Stochastic basically means building one thing on top of the other. Stochastic activism and social nudging are tools that you can use in order to push a population of people in a certain direction in order to make certain choices. So of course, this is quite interesting to study academically, and it has been studied academically as well. So these studies have first and foremost tried to connect environment and happiness. And now I'm following in the same line of thought here, and the same line of reasoning as freedom to roam. If I have the right to go out in nature and enjoy nature in the way I want, if I have that right, then that's a freedom. And the historical and cultural heritage of freedom in the Scandinavian countries is much connected to the development today. So this study, or these studies to look at how happiness is connected with the environment, sometimes it's referred to, when you look at the economic values of this, experienced preference valuation. You try to evaluate what economic effect a certain choice would have, and what that means for the individual. There's a growing interest in pro-environmental behavior effects. So when I behave in a way that contributes positively towards the environment, and the environment itself is a contributor to happiness, which is why I have included the freedom to roam, allemansrätten, in this lecture as well. Both because it connects historically to the freedoms and the development of freedoms for all people, such as the right to vote for women, and to very modern developments. To understand the reason why sometimes we say that these Scandinavian countries are very happy. It's important, though, to say that happiness is not perceived by everyone. that there are presentations of Scandinavian countries in global media that are quite contrary and opposite to the picture that I'm portraying now. You might have seen articles in global media about Sweden being the rape capital of the world, for example. But there are always issues with statistics. The explanation for the very high number of reported rapes, some of the highest numbers in the world, is that it's okay to report rape in Scandinavian countries. It's illegal and you can report it. As a woman, there's no stigma. You won't be found guilty in any way. There's no risk for a woman in reporting, or a man in reporting, that you've been raped. There's no social stigma, or very little social stigma compared to some of the countries where there is much more stigma, an actual risk to your person or risk legally. So we have to understand statistics, and we have to take on a perspective that includes our valuation or our critical evaluation of the statistics that we're using. I'm just talking about positive and negative aspects of statistics, and also the way we view. The picture I'm painting, as I said, looks very good, but you might have seen other reports, contrary reports, people talking about how much tax we pay in Scandinavian countries, the fact that Sweden has been portrayed as the rape capital of the world. Our freedom of speech got us in trouble with China and Chinese relations not that long ago, because a Swedish TV show made fun of China, and you can do that here. It can pose problems in the relationship with other countries, of course. Like I said, the reason why Sweden is sometimes listed as the rape capital of the world is because there's a very high number of reported rapes, because it's okay to report rape, and because it doesn't have any legal implications for the person reporting it. There's no stigma, or there is stigma, but there's not as much as in other places. So we have to understand statistics, and this is part of that. This is the European Union Social Progress Index, and it shows exactly what I was talking about before. If you want to investigate this further, you can look up the European Union Social Progress Index. It measures an index of statistics and indicators that are compiled in order to measure social progress. So it includes, for example, access to healthcare, access to education. And as you can see, there is a divide between Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Northern Europe. The more green, the higher. And since 2019, you have to think away these people. They're no longer a part of the European Union. So the next time we look, they're not accounted for. Here you have Regional Social Progress Index for 2020. And this time, the UK is not included. As you can see, there's still a divide in social progress between East and West, South and North, which of course the European Union is addressing. You can also see similar trends when you look at GDP per capita, which is a slightly different measurement. But if GDP per capita was the only measurement, Portugal would not be green. So this is a difference. If you look at, for example, Greece, which has had or experienced similar economic problems as Portugal, you can see that social progress within these two countries is actually different. So there are other things that affect this. And when we look at the European Union Social Progress Index, we can see divides within the European countries that go back to these differences that I have been talking about before. Culturally, just the perception, for example, that about equal rights, about access to certain things, about the way that society is been built up. And I know that it can sound crazy, but there are points in history and the development of these cultures that has led to the differences that we still see today. Some of them in very recent history, such as alliance with the East Bloc. Some of them further back in history, such as alliance with the Catholic Church or the Protestant Reformation. This is another such index, and this is the Regional Competitiveness Index. So instead of the country listing, this is regions within the European Union. This is in 2019. When we look at that index, sorry, you can see the same divide. You can also see that, of course, larger cities contribute to competitiveness. You can see that the deep green area here is Stockholm, Helsinki, Copenhagen, and Malmö, London. You can see the division between North Italy and South of Italy. And division within countries as well. Now, some of the reasons for this is the infrastructure and the development that happened within Scandinavia. We were late on developing into industrialization, but we in Scandinavia were strong on developing the Scandinavian method or the Scandinavian model. And again, I'm returning to workers' rights, equality. And if we compare the previous map with this map, which is the unemployment rate in Europe in 2018, before the pandemic, because I can't account for the pandemic when showing you the data, because that will make it very strange. I will show you why it's difficult to use post-pandemic data. If you look at this, we can see some of the same divisions between the competitiveness and unemployment. There's a connection. Let's flip a little bit back and forth between these. Have a look at this. Look at, for example, the north of Italy and the south of Italy. Look at Spain. And look at the Scandinavian countries, Norway excluded because Norway is not a part of the European Union. Look at the regions and also look at Germany. Do you see the deep blue in Germany with a very, very low unemployment rate? Do you see the way Germany lights up in the competitiveness ratings? If you look at this South Italy and Greece, you can see the same pattern here. Competitiveness, unemployment. They are linked. Look at the north of Sweden. A common perception, look at the north of Norway. Common perception is that all you see there is basically mountains and woods, a few reindeer. How can unemployment rate be so low? Well, we have to go back to geopolitical factors. And here I'm going to start talking about social democrats. Traditionally, the social democrats are very strong in the north of Sweden because that is a part of Sweden where employment in industry, for example, is very strong, where worker unions have been traditionally very strong, where Swedish manufacturing is. And there's a link between all of these things. So let's move on from statistics a little bit, just noting the reason why I didn't want to include post-pandemic data. Look at this bump in unemployment during the pandemic. So things aren't really back to normal yet, unfortunately. This is unemployment in Europe in 2022. It is lower than before, but there's been a huge bump in unemployment during the pandemic, which is problematic. Talking about geopolitics, the European Union, this political and economic union that we were talking about before, 27 countries with internal single market, with a standardized system of laws, with policies to ensure free movement of people. We were talking about that earlier. Free movement of goods, common policies on trade, agriculture, fishery, so on. Are you following the debate on Sweden and Finland joining NATO? It's looking very likely that we're joining NATO. An international alliance, defense alliance. If an attack occurs on one of the state members, it's an attack on all. One of the reasons why Sweden has been a, look at my quotation marks in the air here, neutral country. That's not really true. But no one told you which alliance we had during the Second World War. Did you know that Sweden was developing our own nuclear weapons? No? It was a nuclear program to develop nuclear weapons. No, one of the best kept secrets of our day, perhaps, leading to a very early development towards nuclear power plants in Sweden as well. But you know, when we during the Cold War and had an enemy, or were going to name an enemy, we were always pointing that direction. I'm pointing east. Note to the people online, I'm pointing east. It's always been pretty clear, actually, to everyone. And Sweden has been neutral in many alliances. We have played a neutral role. It's served us very well, but it's much due to that placement, geography, west, east. Think about the wall dividing East and West Germany. We're smack in the middle, actually. Sweden chose not to join NATO in 1949. This is after the Second World War, when the Cold War is starting. The security policy then was aiming for what's called non-alignment, peace, neutrality, and war. Now, one of the very good reasons for not going to war is that it's very expensive with wars. If you compare, for example, with the GDP of the United States, a large part of the GDP of the United States is produced by weapons manufacturing. And at the same time, a lot of it is invested into the military. Financially, economically, the United States would suffer from peace. Am I right? Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And then eventually later on, he got indicted for.
What if I tell you that the revenues from Sweden's weapons manufacturing plays an almost equally large role in the Swedish GDP per capita?
Say that again.
So Bofors, for example, one of the Swedish weapons manufacturing companies, is one of the very large contributors to Swedish GDP. But we're non-aligned. So it doesn't have that much of a political impact. Sweden has chosen to be a non-aligned country, and much of the economic boom that was experienced in Sweden after the Second World War, with the start in the development of the Swedish welfare state and the Scandinavian model, was in fact due to the non-involvement in war. Economy never suffered. Think about it. Think about the way Sweden acted during the pandemic. Think about the way Scandinavian countries, until they were forced by political forces to shut down, but Sweden remained a very open country during the pandemic. Is that your general perception? In large, actually, an economic choice, because economies suffered from closing down. Now, the power to make decisions like that is well embedded both in the mentality, the political philosophy, and the social policies created during what we will investigate now. The development from the 1950s and on, the creation of the Swedish welfare state and the Scandinavian model. You know that the threats are different than during the Cold War. Threats today are, in a quite recent report on global threats and threats to Scandinavia, returning citizens from the Islamic State and immigration. As you know, Sweden for a long time, and the Scandinavian countries in general, have had large immigration from the Middle East, and a very small percentage of now Swedish residents went to fight and to join the Islamic State, and are now coming back, which means that they pose a security threat. I think our security police named 2 or 3 people. So it's not the majority, and but it is considered a threat. Also increased digitalization, digital warfare. And now we're moving into more recent culture. And I want you to think back to the index of digital competitiveness. And now I want you to connect that, the digital competitiveness of the Scandinavian countries, with the possible threats of increased digitalization and digital warfare. Does your home country, do you have cyber soldiers? Do you have digital soldiers? Yes. Yeah. Do you know? No? Modern warfare? You do? Iran does, definitely. This is the way wars are fought. We have digital attacks on Scandinavian infrastructure. Electricity grid, for example, is constantly under attack from foreign hackers. Some of the countries named here are China, Russia, and the United States that constantly attack the Scandinavian countries. And again, if you think about the geopolitical areas, we're smack in the middle, right? Do you agree with me when I say that we're smack in the middle of this? Both the East and the West pose threats. Hence the non-alignment. Hence the very difficult decision of Sweden and Finland as Nordic countries joining NATO. We have climate change and environmental issues as well, of course, the Baltic Sea pollution and our use of natural resources. The reason why Norway became such a rich country is oil. Yes. The reason why Sweden became a very, very rich country in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Companies? What companies? Husqvarna, yes, I agree with you. Volvo, Saab, IKEA, okay. Scania, okay. What do you make cars out of?
Iron and steel.
Steel. What do you make furniture out of?
Wood.
Wood. What do we have in Sweden? Steel and wood. All right, so not strange at all, right? But it does, in comparison with the cultural aspects, put us in a different position to understand the geopolitical effects governing the development of culture in the post-war era. Now, if we look at the cultural aspects and we mix everything together into a summary of cultural aspects that are relevant here in the now, then if we look at a comparison between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, we can see that the countries are actually working in the political agenda on slightly different things. What I've done is to summarize the most discussed issues in each of the elections in these countries. You know that Sweden had a very recent election, right? And these are the main questions discussed in the elections. Human rights and equality. Simplicity of life, also meaning how easy it is to take part in the welfare system, how easy it is to gain access to social security. Politeness, are cultural aspects discussed when culture clashes. As you know, in recent years, there has been an increase in right-wing politics and right-wing sentiments, and also nationalist or even racist sentiments in the Scandinavian countries, in large due to openness to immigration. And this is, of course, if you look at society overall, something that happens. These are waves that tend to happen. In the 1990s, we had large immigration from the former Yugoslav populations when when Yugoslavia fell, And before that, we had immigration from South Europe in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s. National identity and independence of Norway, one of the reasons why they're not in the European Union. Anti-urban sentiments in Norway. Levande landsbygd, the idea that you want to keep the parts that are not around the cities alive. This is, of course, strongly connected with the economy. Remember the unemployment rates in Norway? In the most rural areas, the unemployment rates are the lowest. Of course, as a Norwegian, you want to keep that. You don't want all the jobs to be in the cities. Also something called janteloven. Do you know what janteloven is? We have it in Sweden as well as in Norway, jantelagen. The idea that you're not supposed to brag, you're not supposed to say that you're better than someone. A very long idea that you don't brag, you don't say that you're better than someone. And if you are better than someone, I'm going to dislike you a little bit for saying it, even if I agree with you. And it comes from an idea about equality, that you're not supposed to be better than someone else, or at least you're not supposed to show it. It has nothing to do with your qualifications at all. It has to do with bragging. So let's actually pick it. We have a student from Italy. Let's pick Italy as an example to compare cultures. Now, I don't know if you're old enough, but la bella figura. Do you know what that is? What is la bella figura?
The representation of an ideal of the idea that everybody is aiming towards, or
the idea that everyone's aiming for. Or yeah, okay. You dress well, you present well, you present your best attributes, you put your best foot forward, right? Now that is the exact opposite of janteloven. You're supposed to present as an equal in Scandinavian countries. It's beneficial for you to present as an equal, nothing other than nothing out of the ordinary. Okay, let's think, pair, and share again. In your culture, notice that I'm using culture because within nations and countries there are very many different cultures. In your culture, is your culture more towards janteloven or la bella figura? Think and then pair and share.
Carl, what do we do online? We have quite few students online.
So at the same time as we're discussing this, I'm going to introduce you to the Swedish concept of lagom. The Swedish concept of lagom is very much connected to janteloven. To be lagom means just right. Just the right amount. Not too much, not too little. Also a very old concept, and a concept that has influenced Scandinavian politics quite a bit. Okay, so I'm going to continue talking. We have a buzzing classroom here, and I also see that we have students in the chat. Let's see. What do we do online? 7 students are online. We can hear you, but I'll continue the lecture now. So moving on from the cultural aspects, I'm actually going to speed up my lecture a little bit now. And I'm going to introduce you to one way of measuring cultural differences. And the reason why I do this is to illustrate how extreme the Scandinavian countries are in comparison culturally. I mean, I realize that we are the strange ones in Scandinavia, especially the Danish. This is a way of measuring differences between cultures that you can access yourself. I actually sent out the link to those of you who are in the Life and Studies courses, sent out a link to Hofstede Insights. And if you just Google Hofstede Insight country comparisons, you can do this for yourself. You can compare your culture, unfortunately associated with nationality. Otherwise, there would be too many. But here we compare cultures in 6 different aspects. Power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. Power distance is how much less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country expect and accept that power is distributed unequally, right? Sometimes described as the difference between me and my boss. So I call my boss by her first name. And if I come up with an idea, she would consider it, and vice versa. If she tells me to do something, I say yes or no. Which is inconceivable in other cultures. Power distance, if we look at Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, is quite low. Sometimes described as flat hierarchies, that there's very little distance in hierarchies. If we look at individualism instead, individualism is described as the degree of interdependence a society maintains among its members, meaning how much I depend on other people, for example, family members, to be able to go about my everyday life and do the things that I want to. How much family members make an impact on my life choices, for example. How much my economy is shared with my family. Masculinity is a measurement of motivation and wanting to be the best, which is described as a masculine trait, and feminine or femininity, liking what you do. So basically, I hate this job, but I have to keep this job in order to have health insurance and money. My boss can fire me at any time, or I like what I do. I chose to work here because I like doing what I do. That's masculinity, but also achievement, how much I strive towards becoming someone or liking what I do. Sometimes it's associated with aesthetics, for example. Uncertainty avoidance, which is quite low in Scandinavian countries, is the extent to which members of a culture feel threatened by unknown situations or not knowing what's going to happen. If you're at a bus stop in Sweden or Norway or Denmark or Finland or Germany, there's going to be a timetable, and it's going to say when the bus will arrive, and the bus will arrive in 1 or 2 minutes. If you're in Japan, the bus will arrive at the minute, and if they don't, they will apologize profusely. If you are in Cambodia, or if you are in Kenya, you wait for the bus, there's no timetable. If you're in Colombia, for example, am I right? That's uncertainty avoidance. If you're in Italy, there is a timetable, but no one cares. No. So long-term orientation is how much the society as a whole, political decisions, for example, maintain links with their past in making the present choices. The whole, what this entire lecture is about, actually. But if we look at some countries, they have a very long tradition of making rules based on certain cultural aspects. The modern day theocracies, for example, theocracy means a country that is ruled by religious law. So theocratic countries often are connected with long-term orientation, but at the same time, countries like China also rate highly in long-term orientation because of the strategic plans and the way that the countries operate. Then finally, we have indulgence, the extent to which people try to control their desire and impulses. And as you can see, indulgence in the Scandinavian countries is quite high, which is very opposed to the idea that we would have Protestant Lutheran influence where you're supposed to restrict yourself. But that is because secularization. Scandinavian countries have now become much more secular than they were just 100 years ago. These are now secular countries, which means that indulgence is very high. as opposed to more religious countries where indulgence tends to be lower. You're expected by society to not do certain things. Here, you can see a comparison, and I've included a few different countries. You can see power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence here. China is purple. Russia is green or gray. The upper right-hand corner here is Russia. The United States, yellow. Iran is green. Italy is light gray, the left-hand lower corner. And Brazil is dark green in the lower right-hand corner. And as you remember, power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. So let's look, for example, at indulgence in China and Russia compared with the United States. So the top row compared with the yellow in the rightmost table here. As you can see, indulgence both in China and Russia compared with the United States is quite different. Society in the United States allow for breaking conventions, doing what you want, whilst in Russia and China, that is quite different, right? Look at Iran and compare. So when we look at Italy as a Southern European country, for example, religious influence and the very strong connections with tradition overall, not always connected with religion, means that indulgence gets a low score here. The levels here are the levels from the previous comparison, this one. I've taken this and I will compare first with China. Look at indulgence compared to the Scandinavian countries, and look at power distance. Compare China with very high power distance with the Scandinavian countries with very low power distance. China has low individualism, whilst the Scandinavian countries have very high individualism. And these are cultural effects. If we continue on in this comparison, if we look at Iran, for example, you can see that Iran, in one way, aligns quite closely in indulgence. They're middle, because Iran has traditions that are not aligned with religion or other religions. If you go back to the history of Zoroastrianism, for example, there are still Persian traditions remaining in Iran that in different ways actually break with religious traditions. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys, or I'm not an expert. I think that this comparison is quite interesting because it connects to historical aspects. You know that in the 1700s in Sweden and also across the Scandinavian countries, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, the right to meet was developed, which now has made its way into the way that these democracies function today. Public access. I can ask for any document produced within any government institution in Sweden, and they have to give it to me by law. free access or public access. That's also different from many other countries. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. A central aspect of the Nordic model is that the publicly provided welfare services and the social security systems cover an individual's entire life course, like I was talking about before. Universal access. If we think about the historical aspects, just to summarize, the state religion changed. Again, breaking from connections with Southern Europe, creating one of the reasons for the divide between the North and the South. But actually, church and state were formally separated in 2000 in Sweden. There were still political connections from the church into the state of Sweden. But now, this is what it looks like. If we look at Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, this is the religion distribution for these countries. As you can see, there is quite a wide spread of religion in the different countries. The unaffiliated or agnostic or atheist group is quite equal. As you can see in Sweden, the largest. You can also see that Sweden has a large Lutheran Christian population, but that they're quite equal. That Denmark has a slightly larger population of Orthodox Christians. And overall, there are quite a lot of different world religions represented. Now, I've portrayed it as this instead. The number of people in surveys who say that they either believe in God, believe in something, or believe in nothing or no God. Sweden stands out as a very secular country, where half of the population say that they believe in nothing, and a small part say that they believe in something, but they don't know what it is. If we combine the purple and yellow parts of the pie charts in each of the countries, you can see that the vast majority of people in all of the Scandinavian countries now consider them at least not adherent to the Christian faith that shaped the changes of society into the welfare state so much in the 1800s, end of the 1800s. A lot have changed in 200 years. The fact that we stayed neutral in the Second World War, but had to ship iron ore to the Germans. See, I said neutral within quotation marks. And the fact that that choice means that we didn't have the impact on the economy, but also the fact this was because of our natural resources. The deal with Germany to avoid Germany invading us in the Second World War was to trade iron ore. Norway chose not to trade oil and heavy water. They were invaded. So if we look at the political systems and compare, Denmark and Norway and Sweden are all parliamentary representative democracies. We pick people to go to the parliament and represent the population overall in a democracy. They're all constitutional monarchies. One difference is that Denmark is also a decentralized unitary state because of Greenland. So they have a territory, Greenland, which is the largest part of Denmark, which have self-governance. Do you know that the United States during the Trump administration tried to buy Greenland? Why? Yeah, why would you want to buy? Why would you want to buy Greenland? use their natural resources. Yes. And the strategic position to bomb the Russia, of course. Right. So a quick overview, and I'll move through these quickly now. A quick overview of the political systems. Denmark. Danish parliament is called Krigshamborg. 2% threshold to enter parliament. It means that if you're a political party and you get 2% of the votes, you're in parliament. You have representation. Threshold is actually compared very low. Sweden has 4%. Turkey, for example, has 10%. One conclusion here is that it's actually very easy to gain political representation in parliament in the Scandinavian countries. And that there are many different parties. I often play around with these questions a little bit. How many parties are represented in Chinese parliament? In Chinese parliament, how many parties are represented? One? Only one. How many parties are represented in United States Parliament? 2. The UK? The United Kingdom? 2. Sweden, anyone? 9. It's relatively easy. And what happens is that none of these parties tend to get above 50% of the votes, right? So in Denmark, for example, it's very common to have minority coalitions where 2 or 3 parties come together, joining their votes to get over 50%. This is a very common way of forming government. These coalitions in Denmark are fully. They're political pacts called fællesskab. And it's created from community feeling, cooperation across party borders. Now, Denmark is actually one of these countries where the Queen appoints the Prime Minister, as opposed to Sweden, where the King doesn't really have any actual power. Denmark still has a monarch with a very small political part. She appoints 2 prime ministers, 2 candidates, statsminister, and then you have Dronning Rune, and she decides on 2. Then a vote, who becomes the one to form a government. Hasn't happened in Sweden since 1974. In Norway, Norwegian parliament is called Storting. And if you remember the lecture, if you were part of the lecture last time, I mentioned that the Vikings had ting, democratic meetings, where all the kings came together with all their people to vote and solve things once a year. Ting, Storting. Election threshold 4%. Sweden. Threshold of 4%. Riksdag is the name of the Swedish parliament. And after being elected prime minister, the prime minister appoints a cabinet of ministers. You take office, and then this is presented to the monarch. Basically, he gets to visit the king and say, "Hi, I'm the new prime minister." Common political issues. Again, going back to the elections, Denmark, national economy, economic growth, growth of the public sector, welfare state topics, utlänningspolitik, immigration politics. Norway, EU membership, always. EU wants larger fishing rights in Norwegian waters, also a natural resource. Healthcare, immigration, Sweden, healthcare, retirement funds, immigration, climate change. These are all effects of being in the top of the lists, right? And the geopolitical position and the natural resources that now bring about issues like these. Building a welfare state means that these are the issues discussed in parliament, and in much due to what we call the Nordic model. So the Nordic model started being developed in the 1930s. The Prime Minister then, Per Albin Hansson, who was also the guy in charge of developing nuclear arms, he saw that developing a social welfare state would be highly beneficial and that the economy could actually support this. So the first ideas of forming what became the Scandinavian model started there. A combination of high living standards and low income disparity. Income disparity is how much difference there is between what the poorest person and richest person make per year, and also how many people own most of the money, so to speak. The idea was to have large economic growth and to benefit from it by lowering income disparity. At the same time, you could produce social benefits such as free education, free healthcare, guaranteed pension payments, a system that is now becoming more unstable than it has been for a long time. Problematically. So it's on the agenda all the time, of course. Because we're so strange, everyone wants this. Okay, that you shouldn't say everyone, especially in academia. I shouldn't be saying everyone, but you guys, you're smart enough to understand that it's not actually everyone, but most, the majority, most everyone. Benefits funded by taxpayers, administered by the government. There's a high trust in government. Policymakers have chosen a mixed economic system that reduces the gap between the rich and the poor through redistributive taxation, meaning I pay for the people who can't pay. And that's also critique against this Scandinavian model, that I pay for people who can't pay. Because in a global context, there are people who perceive that to be unfair. Why should I pay for them? Why don't they get a job? So it's difficult to comprehend that sometimes. Capitalist economy that encourages creative destruction. Creative destruction is basically a term to describe that sometimes we have to work against free economy. Sometimes there has to be redistribution of funds, so to speak. And it's easy for companies to shed workers and change strategy, but employees are supported by generous social welfare programs. which goes back to strong worker unions. And now I'm getting to the farmers. Soon I'll draw a conclusion here. Historically, we had family-driven agriculture resulting in small family-driven businesses. Gibbs, where we are today, is actually famous for his research regarding small family business. Because we're at in a part of Sweden, I don't know if you know Gnosjöandan. Gnosjö is a small village south of Jönköping that is internationally famous for something called the Gnosjö spirit, Gnosjöandan, where small family businesses come together in collaboration in order to fill big orders. For example, I own a business that can produce screws, and my friend has a business that can produce nuts. So IKEA contact me and they ask, can you produce the nuts and bolts for a chair that we're producing? We need 100 million of these. And I say, sure thing, knowing that I have no chance in producing both the nuts and the bolts, right? But I call my friend and I say, hey, I have this lucrative deal with IKEA. Do you want a 50% deal? And I will pay you when they pay me. My friend says, sure thing. And together we land huge international deals. And an example of Gnosjöandan, this type of collaboration, but also the fact that you have small scale production at a very large scale. So solutions in society here that benefit one member of the society are likely to benefit all members of society. Equal for all, the idea of janteloven and lagom, equal for all. That one rule applies to everyone. Sometimes it can be very strange for people coming to Sweden that there's no benefit of having a lot of money. You're not going to get a higher grade just because you can pay. That can be very confusing. Of course, there are some benefits to it, but as an example, this type of equality, like gender equality, it is embedded since 100 years back in the mentality of Scandinavians. So what are the issues with the Nordic model then? What's the problem? Why don't all countries do this? Well, mentality is of course different, but also there are actual issues with this model. Aging population. If you have good health care, you'll have long life expectancy, which means that retirement funds, pensions are expensive. The longer people live, the more expensive they are after they retire. Large immigration, and immigration costs money, or actually it at least costs money for the duration of time for someone to settle into society and start paying taxes, right? One part of the success of at least Denmark and Sweden is the high immigration, because immigrants become productive elements in society, paying taxes, supporting society. Work both ways. New arrivals often come from nations that do not have this long history of making decisions on behalf of the common good. And that is an issue because it has actually increased corruption and non-tax paying, trying to avoid paying taxes. Because this is weird. And now I'm arriving at my summary using myself as an example in order to illustrate to you Scandinavian thoughts and ideas I actually enjoy paying taxes. I think taxes are good. And in many parts of the world, people would consider me very strange for saying so, right? But due to this model and due to understanding the system, yeah, that's part of the way that I think. So, in summary, common language, cultural heritage of working together, both in agriculture and exploration, since the Vikings, in times of war and in times of peace, in political, cultural, or religious dispute or unions, has created a belief that everyone is equal and that society is responsible for the individual, but also that the individual is responsible for the society. And it has likewise shaped the thought and ideas of Scandinavians towards a competitive society driven by innovative small family business and liberal creative destruction, as well as happy society focusing on sustainable use of resources and the value of nature. Does this sound roughly like the stuff I've been saying? Low power distance, flat hierarchies, high individualism. It's more important that you like what you do than to be successful doing something you don't like. If I was to break janteloven and brag to you about my job, I would talk to you about how little I work and how often I can get time off from work and how much I like what I do. Religion doesn't decide what you can or cannot do here. And this, okay, summary. If you tell a person in Scandinavia to do something and you argue that they should do it because of religion, they're going to laugh at you and say, I don't believe in your religion. And this can be very difficult to understand. But if you argue that they should do it because of the environment, or if you argue that they should do it because of equality, because the same rules for all, they're gonna believe you. So, thanks everyone for listening. It was nice having you, and I hope you've gained some insight into Scandinavian thoughts and ideas.
Carl, can you please tell the students like